Hello everybody, welcome to this Magic the Gathering altar tutorial video. Today we are altering a blood moon and we've got our budget brushes from the dollar store. We've got some semi-budget acrylic paints. I think they were 50 bucks for like 10 colors. We've got about, we got a jar with some water in it, and of course we have our blood moon ready to go. And first thing we're doing is we're grabbing a little bit of sandpaper that I got handy right here. We're gonna sand down all of these borders because today this blood moon is going to be more like a border extension altar rather than a full art. So we're grabbing the sandpaper and all across the borders that we're planning to cover with paint. We're just going to sand it down a little bit. We do this to help the paint stick. If you don't do this, you'll find that your paint might slip and slide over the card more than it sticks. So I'm just going to roughen it up a little bit. Not until the point where the whole card's white or sand it down too much. Just a little bit to roughen it up so the paint sticks. So with that done, wipe off any excess dust that came off the card from the sanding. And with that, we'd be ready to go and put some paint on. So obviously, Blood Moon, a very red card. We're going to be using quite a bit of a red paint. We've got some black. We got some yellows, just in case we need to make orange, and some whites. And this last color looks red, but it's kind of like a purplish rose kind of color. At least it says so on the tube. So first thing, we got to guess what the exact color is to put on as a base layer. The base layer is going to be quite dark. Dark colors are better at covering up the border that is underneath our paint. So we're trying to mix some blacks and some reds, and we're basically trying to recreate this. At this point I'm guessing red, but actually it's more like a purpley kind of hue, but it takes me a while to figure that out in this video. So we're mixing up some reds, some whites, some blacks, and we're just putting it on. Not too worried about matching the color 100%, but give it our best shot anyways. It takes a couple of layers of paint to cover up the entire border anyway, so it's not a disaster if you don't get the hue 100% correct on our first go. And the more layers we put on, the closer we will get to the actual color of the card, which in this case will be a little bit more purplish than I expected at first. It's funny how that works sometimes. You can look at a color and think like, oh yeah, this is totally like dark red, but to match the color exactly, sometimes you need to add in some different colors, in this case some of the rose and some of the yellows later on as well. But for now we're not too worried about that. Just some blacks, some reds, and some whites all the way around the card, basically just trying to cover up the entire border we're painting on. So with that done, that's layer number one. It needs to dry a little bit, but it only takes a couple, like maybe a minute or so with acrylic paints, maybe two. So by the time we make our way around, we can hit the same spot where we started, and the paint will have dried in that time in this region, so we can smear on some more. So I noticed I went a little bit too dark on my first layer, so I'm adding a little bit more white to give a second try at matching this background color. And even though it is closer, it's still not 100% correct. Note how it's more of like a grayish hue rather than that dark red purple color on the original art of the card. But even so, it's closer than it has been, so I decided to maybe add in a touch of red and just smear it on anyways, because we're definitely heading in the right direction, even though it might not be 100% correct just yet. It's getting there, it's getting close. So same thing, take it all around the card. Every now and then it might show up a little bit too dark, but we'll fix that later. Here I'm cleaning my brush. Just a quick note, when you are cleaning your brush and you just dabbed it in your water, make sure you clean all the water off the brush, because water drips down. You definitely don't want to have a drop of water run down your brush and onto your card in the middle of altering, so make sure you get every single drop of water out of there. So I'm starting out fresh, clean brush, and giving this color matching another go. And at this point, I've come across this color that's perfect for this bottom right corner. So it's like a reddish hue, but it's slightly more red than we have, or slightly more white than we have been using before. But I figured it matched this color quite nicely. That's like in the bottom right of the card, so we're just gonna smear that on. I've also just grabbed my first little bit of rose, indicating that I'm on the right track, thinking, hey, maybe red's not the way to go, maybe it's more like a purple. I'm even grabbing a little bit of yellow for this left side of the card, and once we get that going into the mix, along with some more red and some of the rose, we're getting pretty close. So as you can see, it's a lot of fiddling to get the right hue, but once you get it, and you can kind of remember or even take notes to know of what you've mixed to get there, and that once you figured it out, it actually goes pretty quick. So here I figured like, hey, this is real darn close to what the actual background color is, tiny bit more yellow, and put it on, and bam, that looks really good. Also, since this is a layer number 2 that we're smearing on, the border, the original border of the card has practically become invisible. So we've covered most of the original border that was on the card. Now with this Blood Moon in particular, the left side of it has a little bit more of a yellow orangey hue to it, and then the right side is more of a deep purple. It's very, very subtle. So if we're painting this, we want to make sure we use more rose on the right side and more yellow on the left side of the card. Just dropping in this darker hue to cover up the border on the top. And here I'm just adding or dapping my brush in some water, because sometimes if you're using cardboard to mix your paints on, paint will dry on the cardboard, and dry paint has a texture to it. It's not like fully glossy, it gets like real rough, which kind of looks funny on the card because the card itself is quite glossy. So to avoid having textures in your paint, you just dip it in a little bit of water, brush off any excess. You don't want your paint to be like dripping. And just take that tiny little bit of water into your paint and smear it on, and then it'll be glossy again. So clean brush, once again, getting close to having good colors on that base layer. And now it's time to make some highlights and put in some of these rocks that are on the bottom of the card of the original art. So I'm taking some red and some of the old original dark color that we had, tiny bit of white in the mix as well. And that whole mix of old color and lighter new colors will make this red hue that is pretty good for making these rocks. So what I'm doing is I've got a lot of paint on the brush, and I'm just kind of following the lay of the land with my brush in diagonal angles, and every now and then I'll let the paint, there's big blobs of paint on the brush, and I'll let them touch the card. Not really smearing any of them out, but just gently touching that card. And that creates that rock-like texture. Here I'm just gently brushing some more paint on just to get that glow that the original art has too. The more you gently brush your paintbrush along, it'll get that glowy effect. And this Blood Moon thing and the reflection of the moon is definitely on the glowing side of things. So on the top part of the rocks, we definitely want some glow, just by gently I almost say, like, I don't think airbrushing is the right word for it, but by lack of a better word, airbrushing your brush against the card to get that glow effect. Same on both sides, left and right, a little bit of that glow. So over on the other side, same of this darker red, let's say mid-range color, and I'm just very gently tapping in a rock-like texture on this other side. Same as we did before, just lots of big blobs of paint on the brush, but I'm not really completing the whole brush stroke. I'm gently just like letting the paint touch the card to release some of it, but not all of it, to create these dots that kind of look like rocks. Same to put in some shadows. We just grab some black and we do the same thing, following the lay of the land, slightly in a diagonal kind of manner, letting the paint touch the card very, very gently and drop in these rock shadowy like shapes. Using that same color, I just made the sky in the top right corner a little bit darker. So here I'm just added a little bit of water onto my brush and mix it with the same color that we had before, the same paint. And what that does is it just makes your paint a little bit thinner, gets that glossy feel to it. Sometimes when your paint gets dry, it gets that rough texture. But if you make your brush wet, you get rid of that rough texture and your paint goes back to glossy smooth. Grab a little bit more of that mid-range red color right now and drop in a tiny, just a couple more of these rocks here in the top left corner of the card. Working our way down here and there, just dropping them in, slight, very slight touches to release a little bit of the paint off the brush into these dot-like textures that form these rock formations. We'll do it all the way to the bottom of the card, dropping them in wherever we feel like. I'm going to swap to my small brush right here. Obviously mostly used for fine little details. Mixing up this highlight color that we had before, a little touch of red, some yellows, a little bit of white, not too much. Just slightly lighter than we had before. And going back here in that bottom left corner of the original picture to drop in a couple more highlights. Just very gentle touches. I like to have my brush a little bit chiseled so that when you touch onto the card, only a tiny little bit of paint releases from your brush. Make sure that your lines, your strokes are sharp and not as blobby as they can be when you apply too much pressure, or when you have like a blobby brush. Make it chiseled, make it thin. Try to make your brush sharp. A little bit more yellow, lighten it up a little bit. And you can see as soon as I touch down very lightly with this brush, instant effect that some of these rocks, some parts of these rocks can get a little bit more light than others. Follow it down all the way to the bottom of the card. And here obviously the rocks are closer, so we're using wider strokes. They can be pretty rough for now, just blobbing them in, and we'll separate those rocks later with some shadows. For now, it doesn't really matter. So here we're grabbing just a little bit of that shadow color, and at the bottom of each rock we drop in a tiny little bit of this darker color to separate them a little bit. And we apply that to pretty much every single separate rock. Here I'm like separating a couple rocks in the top left corner, following the lay of the land as I'm dropping in that shadow. So that one was a lot more vertical rather than horizontal, just because that wall is kind of climbing upward. Same here at the bottom. Chiseled kind of brush, making sure our brush is sharp. Shadow colors to drop in, a couple shadows. And then we go back to our mid-range red color to pop in some rocks here on the right side of the card. Just kind of trying to layer these different types of red on top of one another, going a little bit lighter with each and every layer, and then every now and then go back to the shadow color to drop in a little more shadows. This is a good example of a lighter red at the top of each rock, because that's the part of the rock that would get the light reflected on it from the moon. Back to our shadows, drop a couple of those into. So that's most of our setup done. I feel like the colors are pretty spot on, except for this top right corner right there. But we're going to go ahead and fix that later. For now, we're just going to drop in a couple more of these shadows underneath these rocks here in the top left corner of the card, just to separate them a little bit more. Same thing for this bottom right corner. It can get quite fiddly with the shading. Yeah, the more layers you apply with just slightly different hues and tones will make your rocks look real. So I'm constantly bouncing back and forth between some lighter reds and then some darker shadows, and then adding a little bit of yellow to change up the hue, and constantly layering layer on top of layer on top of layer, and then eventually they'll look real. Here I dropped a little blob of paint onto the card, and a bit of a mess up, but just grab a clean brush and clean that off. I just picked it up with the clean brush and put it aside. Don't try to clean it with your dirty brush, because that'll make things worse. Be sure to grab something clean. And here we go ahead and drop in more shadows to separate these rocks, a little bit more contrast. Clean in the brush. I think we're gonna dip in for one more highlight color, so lots of reds, a lot of yellow to make this more of an orange kind of hue. Not a whole lot else in there, like it's quite bright. And then just with the chiseled edge of the brush, very light touches, we're just gonna highlight the top of each and every individual rock down here to set them apart a little bit more. And then this glow in the top right, need a little bit more touch too. Working our way down on the left side of the card, adding a little bit of that same color. Now I've added a little bit of white because it seems like the left side of the card is a little bit less powerful in the hue, in the orangey tone. So the white would have weakened the color a little bit. Couple more touches on this left wall. And then here we're cleaning up that glow that kind of comes from the center of the original art all the way to the right side of the card. And we want a glowy effect, so I'm tapping the brush heaps and heaps and heaps. Lots and lots of tapping. The more you tap, the glowier and hazier the effect becomes. And yeah, the paint just kind of blends and turns into this smoky kind of haze. Lots and lots of tapping, as you can see. Couple more highlights at the bottom, and a couple more shadows too, and I believe that we're getting to the end of the painting portion of this altar. Just grab my big brush one more time. I think what we're doing is just mixing up this brush that's still a little bit wet from the water from our jar into the old colors that we mixed, and now I'm finally touching up that top right corner that I felt like was still a little bit off color, but now that we've mixed so many reds to make the colors match before from like the rocks and stuff, it's pretty easy to just grab a new brush into the old paint and then get the colors right for the final couple touches. Just trying to make the edges a little bit more dark too, so the moon kind of radiates a little bit more. That's pretty much it for the painting stuff. And now it's time for my least favorite part of making altars. This part gets me every time. We need to clean up the text boxes. We've got a little toothpick-like kitchen tool thing. I'm not even really sure what it's called. But anyways, we dip it in some water. We take off any excess water that we don't want on it, and we start scraping the edges of these text boxes to clean them up because we've painted over them. And basically what we want to do is we want to scrape very gently along the edge, making the paint a little bit wet because we're using, you know, this moist scraping device. And then we take some paper towel to absorb any of the paint that came off and clean it up. Here I scraped off a little bit too much, so that's probably the worst nightmare, but we're gonna fix that later. For now, I'm just cleaning up this right side of the text box, and then we're gonna grab a brush later to fix up this little error that I made. So here we're grabbing a flat brush, same one as I used to clean up my mistake from earlier. Still fairly clean. Mixing up the sky color again. I'm just gonna tap very lightly to clean up the part where I scraped off a little bit too much. Making sure that the brush is very flat, very chiseled, and we just wiggle it back and forth to fill it in. So with that text box cleaned up, it's time to move on to the bottom text box. Same thing, we grab our scraping device, dip it in some water, take off any of the, excess water so nothing will drip onto your card. It needs to be moist, not wet. And we start scraping. Sometimes you might find that cleaning up takes a couple tries, like here in this bottom right corner. Scraping, dabbing, scraping, dabbing. Eventually we get it though. Might take a little while to actually, get it clean. Just putting on the final touches. And with that done, I'm pretty sure our card is complete. The only thing that's left to do is to put a signature on it, which we will do in a second. So thank y'all for watching. I'm pretty happy with how this blood moon turned out. Hope you got something out of the video, whether you just enjoyed watching it, whether it might help you get started on making altars yourself, or how to paint rocks, how to mix colors, that kind of stuff. So if you liked the video, be sure to click the like button. Subscribe to my channel for more altar videos in the future. I might not always have time to make altars or videos for that matter, but I'm definitely going to try to put some more up. Pretty soon. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.